Hello, my name is Petr and welcome to my Discipline of Pop Culture assignment. Today I'll be discussing the discipline of developmental psychology in relation to the game The Binding of Isaac. Child developmental psychology is a field of psychology that examines human growth and development through the childhood years. This field usually looks at the effects of a child's upbringing and their environment on their social and cognitive development later on. The Binding of Isaac is a top-down dungeon crawler game. The story is about a boy trying to escape his mother, who's trying to kill him according to the orders of God, and it is presented as an indie shooter. While this game may sound pretty childish, it's actually very dark and intricately weaves darker themes of abuse and neglect to create a somber game which feels pretty depressing to play. In this presentation, I want to examine the effects of Isaac's environment on his psyche. The game is seen from Isaac's perspective, and so it's a representation of how he sees the world. I want to investigate why what we see in the game exists in its current form in Isaac's mind. Looking at Isaac's past, with his dad leaving without warning and his mom trying to slay him, the likely diagnosis for what we see in the game is a trauma disorder. In order to study the effects of Isaac's upbringing and environment on his mind, we're going to look at three approaches to behavior in psychology. In psychology, the three main approaches to looking at behavior: the biological, social, and cognitive approaches to behavior. I will discuss this as they come, but for a holistic view of Isaac's condition, we have to look at all of the approaches to behavior in relation to the game. First, we will look at the cognitive approach to behavior. The cognitive approach to behavior looks like the best place to start, as it's a field of psychology where we can identify a probable cause for trauma disorder. Cognitive theory posits that cognitive processes follow a clear structure, and the most basic model in cognitive approach is simply the input, mediation, and output model, where information is input, it is processed and output as a behavior. Therefore, if we're able to find a probable cause for a trauma disorder, then because of input, mediation, and output, we can directly say that it is very likely that the output behavior would be a trauma disorder. So the cognitive hypothesis is that if there is probable cause, then the trauma disorder probably exists. There are many common risk factors for trauma disorders in children, as well as three crisis responses that can gauge how serious the trauma will be. The risk factors in children are not living with a nuclear family, ineffective parenting, family dysfunctions, parental PTSD, and maltreatment. Isaac checks every one except for parental PTSD, looking at his backstory. His father left without any warning, his mother tried to kill him and also maltreated him. And so he checks most of the risk factors for trauma disorder. And also, we can look at Isaac's crisis response to investigate if his trauma would be serious or not. Isaac shows major factors that can increase the severity of childhood trauma. He shows relationship strength because his bond with his dad was very strong before his dad left. He shows a serious crisis response, as in many of the endings, he ends up killing himself or self-harming because of the experiences that he's had. And he also interprets the crisis as a crisis and therefore will respond to it much more negatively than if he were not to interpret it so negatively. If we look at the cutscenes, we can say that there is probable cause for a trauma disorder. Now that probable cause has been identified for a trauma disorder, we can look towards other cognitive theories of stress disorders in order to find symptoms that Isaac possesses. If we look at Chemtob's cognitive model for post-traumatic stress disorder, an individual's fear network is consistently activated, and therefore they're in a consistent state of fear and fight or flight response. And therefore, they will also interpret all stimuli as threatening and have a lack of distinction between positive or negative stimuli and a lack of understanding of what will positively or negatively affect them. As evidence to Chemtob's model, I want to look at three enemies in particular. From the brownie, the poo enemy, we can see that Isaac clearly does not understand what he should see as threatening, as there are many personified objects which Isaac fights in the game. And we can also see from the angelic enemies, such as the angelic baby or the boss called Gabriel, that Isaac does not understand what he should see as an ally or enemy, and his perceptions of other people have been severely warped. And this personification of non-sentient enemies, as seen in Brownie, also shows the consistent activation of the fight or flight response, because he doesn't know what to fight, and so he fights everything. Moving on to the social approach, we can use social theory to outline other psychological effects of trauma on intrapersonal interactions. Isaac might suffer from dissociative identity disorder, which is a possible effect of trauma disorder. Dissociative identity disorder is an identity disorder usually caused by childhood trauma and is distinguished by two or more distinct personalities in one person. The symptoms of dissociative identity disorder are two or more different personality states which are completely distinct and recurrent memory gaps. The social approach to behavior hypothesis is that trauma disorder will show within interpersonal reactions, and so we should be able to examine and see signs of trauma disorder when Isaac is in social situations. As evidence of dissociative identity disorder, we can look at the character selection screen. Isaac has multiple personalities which he puts on in the form of costumes, and we can see multiple of these personalities interacting with each other as well, shown in the next slide, suggesting that they are completely distinct, and to the extent where Isaac perceives himself as these characters when he puts on the costumes. We can also see many recurrent memory gaps in Isaac's stories. And this will probably come from an inability to consolidate who he is. We can see from these eventualities the memory gaps that Isaac has, because he has no idea who he is or what kinds of changes are happening to him. On the top left-hand corner of the screen, you can see the cutscene where Isaac meets the blue baby, which is his dead self. But at the same time that he thinks he is his dead self, he is alive and looking at his dead self. Furthermore, the image below that is also a representation of his dead self, as the Forgotten, another character in the game. However, if we look on the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that Isaac perceives himself as Azazel and does not believe he has died in the chest. But from the top right-hand image, we can see that Isaac thinks that he is the character known as the Keeper, and he was actually hanged instead of suffocating in the chest. So we can see all these different memory gaps in Isaac's story that make it really shaky and show that he is not of a sound mental state during the game. The biological approach to behavior deals with neurological structure and how the physical structure of the brain can affect behavior. The main positation of the biological approach is that physical abnormalities in the brain is what causes mental abnormalities, and the mental abnormalities show symptoms physically. Therefore, the biological hypothesis is that Isaac will show physical signs of a trauma disorder if he does possess it. Therefore, we can just cross a checklist and see if he matches the symptoms. There are 3 outwardly shown symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Evidence of self-destructive behaviors, which could be attempted suicide or self-harm, noticeable emotional numbing, and for children especially, the reenactment of trauma through play. As evidence for destructive behaviors, there are 3 items in the game that I want to discuss, and these are the noose, the nail, and the dagger. He is allowed to pick up all these items and use them, and all these items are clear signs of self-destructive behaviors, especially the sacrificial dagger and the nail, which both connotate self-harm, and the noose connotates, suicide. We can see Isaac's emotional numbing through the complete lack of emotional response to all of the monsters he fights and kills throughout the game. He faces his own mother as a boss, as shown on the screen, and slays her and has no response at all. Isaac also faces a boss called It Lives, which is the representation of himself as a failed abortion, but still shows no response. On one of the final stages, he can face the Hush, which is a representation of a suffocated baby in the womb, but he still does not give any emotional reaction to that. Furthermore, if he slays the blue baby, which is his dead self, or if he meets his dead self, he also shows no reaction and acts as if it's normal. Therefore, we can clearly see the amount of emotional numbing that Isaac has gone through throughout the game. For evidence of reenacting trauma, we can look at 3 specific traumas that Isaac clearly reenacts with items in the game. The first one is Mom's knife, and that is a reenactment of when his mom tried to kill him by stabbing him with the same knife. The second trauma is Dad's ring, which is the ring of Isaac's father, who left him, which Isaac was distraught of because he was very close to his dad. The third trauma is the dead cat, called Guppy in the game, and that's because the cat was Isaac's cat, which died, and he kept the body. And so through the use of the dead cat, we can see Isaac reenacting the cat's death and reliving it over and over again. And through all of these items, we can see Isaac reenacting his trauma through his play. So for a final diagnosis, Isaac most likely suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder alongside dissociative identity disorder, given that the game shows the full extent of his symptoms. Thank you very much for listening, and this has been my Discipline of Pop Culture on the Binding of Isaac.